I stood under the cold fluorescent lights, palms sweating against the crumpled plastic of cheap hydrangeas. My ex-husband's new wife smirked, shoving her designer bag onto my designated front row seat. She thought stealing my spot would erase me from my son's brightest moment. She had no idea his upcoming valedictorian speech was not a collection of empty gratitude. It was a truth bomb he had been silently counting down for 10 years. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Addison Silva, and I am 42 years old. The grand auditorium of the Silicon Valley Institute of Technology was a cavern of blinding ambition and architectural excess. Vaulted ceilings stretched toward a meticulously painted mural of the cosmos, while thousands of recessed lights cast a sterile, intimidating glow over the sea of velvet-lined chairs. I stepped through the heavy brass doors, my presence immediately jarring against the symphony of wealth surrounding me. In my hands, I clutched a bouquet of blue hydrangeas I had hastily purchased from a gas station off the interstate. The plastic wrapping crinkled noisily with my every shallow breath, and the edges of the delicate petals were already beginning to show faint brown bruises from the turbulent journey. I smoothed the front of my gray suit dress. It was a garment that had seen better decades, let alone days. The fabric at the cuffs was irreparably frayed, the threads tired and thinning from years of use, but I had spent 45 minutes at the ironing board the night before, pressing every single seam until it was as sharp as broken glass. I wanted to look respectable. I wanted to look like a mother who truly belonged in this towering cathedral of elite intellect. I had arrived 15 minutes early, navigating the crowded, perfumed aisles with a singular, pounding focus. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a phantom reminder of the text message my son, Leo, had sent me earlier that crisp morning. Its words were burned deep into my memory. Row A, seat number 1. I want you to be the first person I see. Those words had been my anchor during the agonizingly long drive here in my unreliable car. But as I finally reached the very front of the auditorium, where the massive stage loomed large and imposing, my anchor violently snapped. There, sitting comfortably in the exact plush, reserved chair that bore my name on a crisp white placard, was Chloe. She was in her early 20s, a flawless, curated picture of inherited wealth and unearned arrogance. As the youngest daughter of a prominent tech tycoon, she wore her privilege like a seamless second skin. Today, that skin was a custom-designed silk dress that likely cost more than my entire annual electricity budget. Beside her sat Marcus, my ex-husband. The man who had walked out on a decade of shared, grueling struggles now looked perfectly tailored, aggressively groomed, and entirely devoid of a spine. Chloe noticed my approach before he did. She stopped adjusting her heavy diamond earrings and looked me up and down. Her gaze was a physical weight, a slow, deliberate, and agonizingly cruel scan that took in the gas station flowers, the meticulously ironed but worn gray dress, and the scuffed toes of my sensible, cheap shoes. She did not bother to hide her utter disgust. In fact, she expertly weaponized it. With a subtle, dismissive tilt of her perfect chin, she delivered the words that were meant to permanently destroy me. "Sorry," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and genuine, unadulterated malice. "This row is only for the real family, the ones who actually funded the boys' future. You can stand in the transient guest area in the back." I froze, the air leaving my lungs in a sharp, entirely silent exhale. I shifted my desperate gaze to Marcus, waiting for him to intervene, to say something, absolutely anything, to defend the mother of his only child. Instead, he stared intently at the glowing screen of his expensive smartphone. He swiped his thumb endlessly, faking a sudden, intense interest in his business emails, completely and deliberately ignoring my existence. It was a pathetic, sickening display of cowardice. the familiar retreat of a man who had sold his soul and was now entirely too afraid of the buyer to speak up. Rage, hot and blindingly bright, flared in the very center of my chest. Every primitive instinct screamed at me to cause a massive scene, to snatch the ridiculous designer bag she had casually tossed onto my rightful seat and hurl it across the crowded room. I wanted to scream until the heavy crystal chandeliers shattered above our heads. But then I looked at the expansive stage. I pictured Leo, nervous and profoundly proud behind the heavy velvet curtain, eagerly waiting for the most important moment of his young life. I would not ruin his day. I absolutely refused to let my righteous anger taint his hard-won victory. The walk back up the long, sloping aisle felt agonizingly slow, a public march of quiet humiliation under the bright, unforgiving venue lights. I bypassed the comfortable, cushioned seats, bypassed the loudly murmuring crowds of affluent, oblivious parents, and found a barren spot at the very back of the immense hall. I positioned myself next to the massive, complicated sound control board. The isolated area smelled faintly of electrical ozone and hot dust, and the industrial cooling fans of the stacked audio equipment hummed with an aggressive, rattling noise that vibrated through the floorboards. I leaned my tired, aching back against the cold, rough cinder block wall. I told myself I was perfectly used to this treatment. I was intimately used to being pushed to the unseen margins, to being cleanly erased from the glamorous, public narrative of success. But even as I stood in the heavy shadows, unfairly banished to the noisy back of the room, I did not lower my head for a single second. I kept my tense shoulders pulled back, my bleeding lip pressed into a firm, defiant line, and my watering eyes locked firmly onto the empty podium on the brightly lit stage. I was ready, waiting with fierce, unwavering certainty for the singular moment my brilliant son would step out into the light. As the rhythmic thumping of the cooling fans vibrated through the cinder block wall and into my spine, the brightly lit auditorium began to blur. The oppressive hum of the audio equipment dragged my mind backward, exactly 10 years into the past. It pulled me back to the precise moment my entire universe collapsed into a terrifying freefall. Marcus had not just left us, he had financially and emotionally amputated us. He packed his custom leather suitcases to chase after the pampered daughter of a ruthless hedge fund manager, taking with him every single cent of our joint life savings. In his wake, he left a suffocating mountain of high-interest debt from his spectacular failure of a tech startup, while he was busy sipping champagne on private yachts. I was staring at bright pink eviction notices taped to our front door. I vividly remember the suffocating chill of the law office where our marriage officially ended. Marcus sat across the polished mahogany table, flanked by a team of high-powered corporate attorneys whose hourly rates could have fed Leo and me for an entire year. Through calculated legal loopholes, Marcus miraculously claimed he was completely unemployed. He successfully dodged every single obligation of child support, weaponizing my lack of a college degree against me to ensure I received absolutely nothing. They handed me a sleek metal pen and essentially told me to sign away my future or face total bankruptcy in a brutal, drawn-out trial. I signed the heavy stack of papers, leaving that frozen room with $0 and a terrified little boy waiting for me at home. But Leo was not just any boy. He possessed a mind that operated in pure, unfiltered brilliance. He built complex machines from discarded scrap, wiring circuit boards before he could properly tie his shoes. However, competitive robotics is an inherently brutal and wildly expensive arena. It requires advanced servos, premium-grade alloys, and custom motherboards that cost thousands of dollars. To feed his insatiable genius, I had to find a way to survive the crushing, exhausting reality of the American working class. I desperately took a job as a night-shift freight dispatcher at Novacor Logistics. It was a massive, unforgiving heavy shipping company where the smell of burning diesel fuel and stale, burnt coffee permanently seeped into my pores. My brutal schedule demanded I sit in a drafty concrete warehouse office from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. 5 days a week, I spent the darkest, most isolated hours of the night screaming into radio transmitters, coordinating massive 18-wheelers through brutal blizzards and treacherous mountain passes. The job was a physical and mental meat grinder that stripped away my youth. The true breaking point arrived exactly 2 weeks before Leo's 14th birthday. He had brilliantly qualified for a prestigious national science competition, but his robot required a highly specific, exceedingly rare processing microchip to function at a championship level. Marcus, attempting to play the role of a generous, involved father from afar, had loudly promised to purchase the component. He swore up and down it would arrive in time, but on the very eve of the birthday, Marcus called my prepaid cell phone. His voice was muffled by the wind, casually explaining he had to cancel the gift because he was unexpectedly tied up on a luxury ski vacation in Aspen. He hung up before I could even scream. I watched Leo sleeping that night, knowing the devastating heartbreak waiting for him in the morning. I could not let his brilliant light be extinguished by his father's callous negligence. The next morning, I walked out to our cracked concrete driveway and stared at the only valuable possession I had left in this world. It was an old, beautifully maintained Ford pickup truck. It was the sole keepsake from my late father, smelling faintly of his cherry pipe tobacco and worn leather. It broke my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces, but I drove it to a local scrapyard dealer and sold it for a thick stack of worn $100 bills. I took that cash, drove straight to a specialized electronics supplier 3 towns over, and purchased the exact processing microchip Leo desperately needed. When I returned home, I carefully wrapped it in plain brown paper. I handed it to my son, looked directly into his shining, hopeful eyes, and told him the most painful lie of my entire life. "Your dad mailed this to you," I said, forcing a warm, convincing smile onto my exhausted, pale face. "He wanted to make sure you had the very best equipment for the national competition." Leo hugged the cardboard box tightly to his chest, his face lighting up with a radiant joy that completely shattered my soul. He believed that lie for years. He believed his father secretly cared, and I willingly swallowed the agonizing poison of that deception to protect his fragile heart from the ugly truth. I gladly faded into the deep background of his life. I quietly accepted the chronic, stabbing back pain from sitting in that cheap dispatcher chair for thousands of hours. I ignored the dark purple bruises on my shins from navigating crowded freight loading docks in the dead of winter. I traded my sleep, my father's memory, and my physical health, all in a silent exchange for the heavy gold medals that eventually began to line my son's bedroom walls. Every ache in my bones was simply the hidden cost of his undeniable greatness. The heavy crimson curtains finally parted, silencing the murmurs of the affluent crowd. A dignified hush fell over the room as the elderly principal stepped up to the polished oak podium. Adjusting his thick spectacles, his amplified voice echoed through the vast amaze. Carrying the weight of decades of institutional prestige, we had reached the pinnacle of the morning. It was time for the final, most coveted recognition of the year. "Ladies and gentlemen," the principal announced, his tone swelling with practiced grandeur, "we now arrive at our highest honor, the Award for Outstanding Young Innovator. This accolade is not merely a certificate of excellence. It comes accompanied by a fully funded, 4-year scholarship to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It is my profound privilege to present this to a student who has redefined the boundaries of artificial intelligence. Please welcome to the stage, Leo Silva Vance." A roaring wave of applause crashed through the auditorium. From my isolated vantage point in the shadowy rear, perfectly aligned with the soundboard, I had an unobstructed, agonizingly clear view of the front row. The instant Leo's name was called, Chloe sprang into action. This was her moment, the exact scene she had carefully choreographed for maximum exposure. Before my son even emerged from the wings, she had whipped out her expensive smartphone, expertly snapping a portable ring light onto the top edge. I watched her quickly dab a layer of shining gloss over her lips, perfectly angling the camera to capture her own face first. She was instantly live-streaming to her thousands of followers, rapidly transitioning her features into a mask of overwhelming, tearful maternal pride. She was ready to play the ultimate angelic stepmother, the benevolent savior who had supposedly fostered a genius. Watching her preen for the glowing screen, a sickening wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. It brought back the bitter taste of the glossy local magazine I had found discarded in a coffee shop exactly 4 weeks ago. Chloe had purchased a massive, full-page public relations spread under the guise of an editorial interview. I remembered staring at the bold, arrogant typeface. In the article, she shamelessly boasted about how her family's private philanthropic charity had served as the financial bedrock for a brilliant local prodigy. She spun a beautiful, entirely fabricated fairy tale about recognizing raw talent and providing the exclusive, high-end research foundation necessary for his robotics project to thrive. There was no mention of the grinding poverty or the sacrifices it actually took. It was a sterile, pristine narrative bought and paid for by a woman who had never once stayed awake until dawn worrying about a utility bill. Then, the stage lights shifted, and all the breath abruptly left my body. Leo stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtain. He was dressed in a flowing, traditional graduation gown, but his posture was anything but typical. He moved with a glacial, deliberate grace. Beside him rolled the crown jewel of his high school career, a sleek, meticulously engineered artificial intelligence model that moved with an eerie, lifelike fluidity. But it was not the brilliant machine that captivated me. It was the look on my son's face. He was the absolute mirror image of my own cold, hardened resilience. There was no bright, triumphant smile. There was no eager waving to the cheering crowd. He possessed a chilling, untouchable calmness, radiating a silent intensity that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. He stepped up to the center podium, allowing the applause to naturally die down. As the final claps faded into an expectant silence, Leo did not immediately speak. Instead, he let his piercing gaze sweep slowly across the expansive room. His eyes descended directly to the VIP section at the very front. From the back, I could clearly see the exact moment his vision locked onto row A, seat number 1. He saw Chloe, practically vibrating with performative joy, her phone thrust high in the air. And then, his eyes shifted downward. He saw the crisp, white placard bearing my name, crumpled and discarded carelessly on the carpeted floor beneath the toe of Chloe's designer heel. A microscopic muscle feathered along his jawline. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening. But after 18 years of studying his face, I knew exactly what it meant. He took a slow, tremendously deep breath, his chest expanding under the dark fabric of his gown. Slowly, he reached out and wrapped his long, capable fingers around the metal stem of the microphone. His grip was so tight his knuckles flashed bone white under the intense stage lighting. Standing by the rattling cooling fans, I felt my heart hammer violently against my ribs. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. Bracing myself, I was absolutely certain of what was about to happen. He was going to pull the neatly folded index cards from his pocket. He was going to lean forward and recite the sterilized, thoroughly vetted speech the school administration had approved 3 days ago. He would express generic gratitude. He would humbly accept the accolades, and he would politely allow the pristine, agonizingly fake theatrical performance of Marcus and Chloe to continue unchecked. I inhaled a shaky breath, preparing to swallow this final bitter pill so his flawless future could begin without a single scandal. Leo leaned forward. The microphone let out a brief, high-pitched whine before settling. "I stand before you today not as a solitary inventor," he began, his voice smooth and resonant, carrying perfectly across the vast expanse of the hall. My achievements, the complex machine standing beside me, the fully funded scholarship awaiting me in the fall. None of these would exist without the profound generosity of my angel investors. I owe everything to those who provided the fundamental resources required to turn a crude, desperate idea into an award-winning reality. Down in the front row, the bait was swallowed whole. Chloe practically vibrated out of her seat. She beamed brightly, raising her phone higher into the air to ensure her live stream captured every single second of this highly anticipated validation. She applauded enthusiastically, the heavy diamonds on her wrists clinking loudly against her designer phone case. Beside her, Marcus shifted his posture. He visibly puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit jacket, adopting the solemn, immensely proud expression of a patriarch finally taking his rightful due. But Leo did not continue with the expected, polite platitudes. He reached into the pocket of his flowing graduation gown and pulled out the thick stack of approved white index cards. Without breaking eye contact with the audience, he deliberately loosened his grip. The cards slipped from his fingers, fluttering down like dead leaves to scatter across the polished wooden floor of the stage. He turned his head slightly, peering through the harsh glare of the stage lights, looking straight past the VIP section, past the endless sea of affluent parents, directly toward the shadowy back wall where I stood. He looked right at the sound control booth. He raised his right hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the student technician operating the main console beside me. The young technician, clearly briefed on this rogue operation, did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He slammed his palm down hard on the heavy spacebar of his laptop. The colossal LED screen dominating the rear of the stage flickered violently. The pristine, rotating digital blueprints of Leo's artificial intelligence model instantly vanished into the digital void. A collective gasp rippled through the 2,000 guests as the screen was suddenly swallowed by a harsh, glaring white light. It was not a technical glitch. It was a massive, high-definition projection of a heavily creased, coffee-stained piece of paper. Then came another, and another. A rapid-fire slideshow of grim, undeniable reality began to play out behind my son. They were faded, crumpled bank transfer receipts. They were piles of overdue utility bills, stamped with threatening red ink. But most prominent of all were the thick, endless stacks of industrial timesheets. The stark, aggressive black font of the Novacor Logistics logo loomed 30 feet high above the stage. The rows of stamped clock and times flashed in relentless, punishing succession. 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, and typed cleanly across the top of every single brutal shift was one undeniable name, Addison Silva. The atmosphere in the auditorium violently shifted. The polite, celebratory murmurs instantly evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating wave of utter confusion. Leo stepped closer to the podium. He raised a firm finger and flicked the metal mesh head of the microphone. A sharp, echoing thud snapped the sprawling audience to full, terrified attention. His voice, previously smooth and inviting, was now a jagged, unforgiving blade of pure steel. "For the public record," Leo declared, his voice booming with absolute, terrifying clarity over the massive speakers. "The charitable fund of my father's new wife has never sponsored a single cent of my research. They did not buy the metal. They did not code the software. They did not feed the creator." He paused, letting the devastating words hang heavy in the chilled, overly air-conditioned air. Down in row A, Chloe's live-streaming phone began to slowly, shakily lower. "My actual angel investor," Leo continued, his voice echoing fiercely off the vaulted ceiling, "paid the ultimate price for my success. She funded this artificial intelligence model with 10,000 hours of severe sleep deprivation in a freezing freight warehouse. She funded my ambitions by quietly selling the last surviving keepsake vehicle of my grandfather. She gave up her youth, her physical health, and her pride so I could stand up here today." Before anyone could fully process the sheer, staggering magnitude of his statement, Leo raised his hand again. The giant screen behind him split perfectly down the middle. On the left side of the screen appeared a massive, blown-up screenshot of a digital email. The date was clearly visible at the top in bold lettering. The text was brief and utterly merciless. It was a message from Marcus. I recognized the phrasing immediately. It read, "I cannot spare $150 for an advanced placement exam fee right now. My assets are currently tied up in new investments. Tell the boy to get a part-time job." On the right side of the screen, displayed in vibrant, sickening color, was a post from Chloe's public Instagram account. The upload timestamp perfectly, flawlessly matched the exact date of Marcus's cruel email. The photo featured Chloe posing elegantly on the hood of a sleek sports car, proudly holding up a brand new, limited edition Hermes handbag. The caption, plastered in massive font for 2,000 people to read, bragged about dropping $15,000 on a spontaneous weekend shopping spree to treat herself. The juxtaposition was completely lethal. It was a masterclass in public execution. The resulting silence was not merely quiet. It was a heavy, dead vacuum that rapidly sucked the oxygen right out of the massive hall. You could hear the faint, frantic buzzing of an insect against a distant window pane. Then, slowly, as if pulled by a single, invisible string of morbid curiosity, the heads of 2,000 affluent guests, esteemed faculty members, and local journalists turned in perfect unison. Thousands of wide, shocked eyes shifted away from the brightly lit stage and plunged directly down toward the front row. They locked onto the reserved VIP section. They locked firmly onto Marcus and Chloe. The two of them were entirely petrified, transformed into grotesque statues of pure, unadulterated panic. Marcus's tailored shoulders were slumped, his face drained of all natural color, his jaw hanging completely slack. Chloe sat frozen in her expensive, custom silk dress, her phone finally slipping from her trembling, manicured fingers and dropping softly onto the carpeted floor. The curated, perfect mask she wore for the world had been violently ripped away, leaving behind nothing but the naked, undeniable truth of their cruelty. The bomb had successfully detonated, and they were trapped squarely at the very center of the blast radius. The suffocating silence holding the auditorium hostage was abruptly shattered. It did not break with a murmur, but with a hysterical, piercing shriek. Chloe leaped to her feet so violently that her heavy mahogany chair tipped backward, crashing loudly onto the carpeted aisle. In a single, frantic second, every ounce of her carefully manufactured aristocratic grace evaporated. The poised, benevolent tech heiress was gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal thrashing wildly against the unyielding walls of public exposure. Her face was contorted into an ugly, sneering mask of pure rage. She pointed a trembling finger wrapped in heavy diamonds toward the sound control booth, her voice cracking as she screamed at the top of her lungs. "Turn it off! Cut his microphone right now. This is an absolute outrage. I'm going to sue this school, the administration, and that little brat for every single penny they have. This is malicious defamation." Her shrill threats bounced off the high vaulted ceilings, echoing terribly in the vast space. Down in the pit of the hall, several elite tech recruiters and local journalists who had been taking notes on Leo's artificial intelligence model immediately flipped their notebooks closed. Their attention shifted entirely to the spectacular meltdown occurring in Row A. From his place of honor beside the main podium, the elderly principal did not flinch. He did not signal the security team to intervene with the broadcast, nor did he look remotely surprised by the explosive presentation. He slowly adjusted his thick spectacles, leaned toward his own tabletop microphone, and spoke with the maddening, untouchable calmness of a man who had tenure and nothing left to lose. "There will be no cutting of microphones today," the principal announced, his steady voice slicing effortlessly through Chloe's hysterical demands. "Furthermore, there are absolutely no grounds for defamation. The administration and the Scholarship Review Board heavily vetted this presentation 3 weeks ago. Every bank statement, every email, and every single timesheet displayed on that screen has been rigorously authenticated. We consider this documented struggle a thoroughly valid and crucial part of the students' overall project journey. Please take your seat, madam." The principal's firm, institutional backing was the final nail in the coffin. The crowd gasped in unison. It was no longer just an angry teenager's accusation. It was an officially sanctioned exposure. Beside the screaming heiress, Marcus looked as though he was actively having a heart attack. A violently dark, mottled red color crawled up his thick neck and entirely consumed his face. The paralyzing humiliation of having his profound financial neglect and cowardice broadcasted to the most powerful people in the valley was tearing him apart from the inside out. Desperate to salvage whatever microscopic shred of dignity he had left, he reached out with trembling hands. "Chloe, please, for the love of God, sit down," Marcus hissed through gritted teeth, grabbing her thin wrist and yanking her hard toward the empty chair. "You are making us look utterly insane in front of the entire board." That desperate, forceful tug was the exact trigger her panicked brain needed to fully short-circuit, operating purely on blind, impulsive fury. Chloe violently wrenched her arm free from his grasp. With her other hand, she swung wildly. The loud, sharp crack of her palm striking Marcus's cheek echoed through the silent auditorium like a gunshot. She had slapped him right across the face. She slapped him so hard, his head snapped aggressively to the side, leaving a stark, blazing red handprint stamped permanently onto his jawline. The audience inhaled sharply. The prestigious, high society event had officially devolved into a cheap, pathetic street brawl. Up on the brightly lit stage, Leo did not flinch at the violent display. He gripped the microphone stand, his eyes narrowing as he looked directly down at the man who had abandoned us. He did not yell. He did not need to. His low, resonant voice commanded absolute authority. "What you left behind was not a foundation," Leo stated, his words meticulously measured and dripping with icy disdain. "It was an abysmal, starving void, and the woman standing at the very back of this hall used her own flesh and blood to fill it." At that precise declaration, the damning spell over the crowd completely broke. A tidal wave of frantic whispers erupted across the 2,000 guests. The very same affluent parents who had gladly rubbed elbows with Chloe at the charity gala last month were now acting as her swift executioners. Dozens of glowing smartphones shot up into the air from the surrounding rows. Flashes went off in rapid succession. They were recording every pathetic second of the wealthy couple's complete psychological collapse, eager to circulate the spectacular ruin on every private country club group chat by noon. The pristine, flawless image of their model family was reduced to absolute ash in less than 5 minutes. Sensing the total loss of control, 3 burly event security guards in dark suits marched briskly down the main center aisle. They surrounded the VIP section, their imposing figures casting long, dark shadows over the cowering couple. "Sir, Madam," the head guard ordered, his tone devoid of any respect usually reserved for front-row guests. "You are disrupting a sanctioned academic ceremony. You need to remain completely silent right now, or we will forcibly escort you off the premises." Marcus, clutching his stinging cheek, shrank down into his expensive tailored jacket. Chloe stood frozen, her chest heaving, staring in sheer horror at the glowing rings of camera lenses pointed directly at her tear-streaked, ruined face. In the span of a single speech, the ultimate guests of honor had been ruthlessly degraded into the most pathetic, despised disruptors in the entire room. The heavy, dark suits of the security team forced a tense, suffocating order over the front row. The frantic clicking of smartphone cameras eventually slowed down as the sheer shock of the confrontation began to settle deep into the bones of the audience. Up on the brilliantly illuminated stage, Leo did not gloat. He did not smile. He simply stood tall, waiting with infinite patience until the massive auditorium grew so entirely quiet that you could hear the soft rustle of the velvet curtains shifting in the air conditioning vents. When the silence was absolute, he reached a steady hand inside the dark folds of his flowing graduation gown. He withdrew a thick, stiff piece of heavy parchment paper. Even from my isolated position at the very back of the hall, I could clearly make out the vibrant, unmistakable stamp of a bright red, embossed state court seal pressed firmly into the bottom corner of the document. Leo smoothed the heavy paper against the wooden podium. He leaned close to the microphone one last time. "Before I step down from this stage," Leo announced, his voice shedding its previous icy edge, replaced now by a profound, unshakable warmth. "Before I officially conclude my high school career and step into my future at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, there is one final piece of business I need to share. For 18 years, I have carried a surname that represented nothing but absence, cowardice, and broken promises, a name that actively tried to starve the very potential it later desperately tried to claim. He held the court document up high, turning it slowly so the harsh stage lights caught the shiny red wax of the official seal. "As of 9 o'clock this morning," my son declared, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable finality, "a Supreme Court judge legally approved my petition. The hollow legacy of my father is completely erased. My name is no longer Vance. I am, and I will forever proudly remain, Leo Silva." The sheer magnitude of that statement struck me like a physical blow to the chest. Silva, my maiden name, the name of my late father, the hard-working mechanic who owned the old Ford truck I had sold to fund this very moment. Leo was taking our name, our blood, and our immense, unseen struggles with him to the highest peaks of academia. Without waiting for a response from the stunned crowd, Leo folded the thick paper and tucked it safely back into his pocket. He turned away from the microphone. He walked past the brilliant, towering artificial intelligence machine he had built from nothing. He descended the short wooden staircase on the side of the stage, his heavy dress shoes thudding softly against the carpeted floor. He approached the reserved VIP section at the very front, Marcus, his face still blazing with the red welt of Chloe's violent slap, looked up with pathetic, watery eyes, perhaps hoping for a final, quiet word of reconciliation. But Leo did not even break his stride. He did not spare his biological father a single, fleeting glance. He walked right past the crying, utterly destroyed heiress and the ruined man beside her, treating them like entirely invisible ghosts. Instead, my brilliant son turned his body and began to walk directly up the long central aisle of the auditorium. 2,000 pairs of eyes immediately followed his path. The esteemed faculty members, the wealthy parents, the elite recruiters, they all turned in their plush seats, craning their necks to see where the valedictorian was going. As Leo marched higher up the sloping floor, the massive crowd seemed to instinctively understand. The people standing in the back aisles naturally parted ways, stepping aside with quiet reverence to clear a wide, unobstructed path for him. He was heading straight for the shadowy, noisy back corner of the room. He was heading straight for the sound control board. He was heading for me. My legs suddenly felt as though they were made of entirely hollow glass. I pressed my aching spine hard against the rough cinder block wall just to keep myself from collapsing onto the floor. The iron grip I had maintained on my emotions for a brutal decade finally shattered into a million pieces. Hot, blinding tears streamed rapidly down my cheeks, ruining my carefully applied makeup, soaking into the collar of my frayed gray suit dress. My hands shook violently, my knuckles stark white as I clung desperately to the bouquet of cheap gas station hydrangeas. Leo stepped out of the bright, ambient light of the main floor and into the heavy shadows of my corner. The aggressive, rattling hum of the equipment cooling fans did not drown out the sound of his steady breathing. He stopped right in front of me. He looked at my tear-stained face, my exhausted eyes, and my trembling hands. "I found you," he whispered softly, a brilliant, genuine smile finally breaking across his handsome face. He reached out and wrapped his strong arms securely around my shaking shoulders, pulling me into a fiercely tight embrace. I buried my face into the dark fabric of his graduation gown, sobbing openly, letting go of the thousands of hours of sleep deprivation, the endless physical pain, and the crushing, silent loneliness. The heavy burden was finally lifted. We had won. Gently, Leo pulled back just enough to reach down. He carefully pried the crumpled, wrinkled plastic wrapping from my bleeding, sweating palms. He took the battered bouquet of blue hydrangeas, the petals slightly browned and bruised from the turbulent journey. He turned around to face the massive, sprawling auditorium with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Leo raised that cheap bundle of dying flowers high into the air above his head, presenting it to the silent crowd as if it were the most prestigious, heavy gold championship trophy in the entire world. For a brief, suspended second, The room was perfectly still. Then, an elderly man in the third row stood up and began to clap. A woman beside him joined in. Within 10 seconds, the sound swelled into a massive, deafening roar. 2,000 people rose to their feet in a thunderous, unified standing ovation. The explosive sound of their applause shook the very foundation of the building, but they were not facing the empty, brightly lit stage. Every single person in that vast hall had turned completely around, facing the dark back corner, directing their immense respect and thunderous cheers squarely at the mother in the worn gray dress. Through my blurry, tearful vision, I caught a brief, fleeting glimpse of movement near the side of the stage. Down in the front row, completely ignored by the cheering masses, Marcus and Chloe were scrambling in sheer, pathetic panic. They grabbed their expensive designer bags, kept their heads bowed low in ultimate humiliation, and slunk quietly out through a dimly lit side fire exit, vanishing entirely from our lives forever. They were gone, swallowed by their own cowardly darkness. But here, standing by the rattling soundboard, surrounded by the deafening roar of absolute victory, Leo and I were completely, undeniably bathed in light. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Zoe Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.